What are we doing in the black community? The number one consumer of a Mercedes-Benz is us. Us. The number one consumer of a Gucci and a Louis Vuitton, us. And they don't even advertise. Why is it that in the black community, we are always the number one consumer, but we're not the number one creators?
So you just said it, the fact that there's consumers and creators. For so long, we assume success based on consumption.
Welcome to Closing the Gap, Truth About Black Wealth. I am your co-host, Mr. Eddie Richardson, here with our owner and host, Mr. Wilbert Hamilton, the owner of Hamilton Wealth Advisors. And we're glad to be able to come to you once again on another day here at WATV V94.9 on your FM dial. And you can also tune in to us on YouTube at Closing the Gap, The Truth. And then also wherever you get your audio podcast, whether that's Spotify, Apple, wherever you get it, you can find us at Closing the Gap, The Truth About Black Wealth. And today, we're coming back and to talk to you about how to leave a legacy. On the last episode, we talked about some different financial plannings, how to secure your success with income planning, tax planning. We left off on legacy planning, and now we want to talk about how to leave a legacy, how to touch the lives of those that you will not even meet. Generational wealth, generational planning, generational structuring for our wealth, and being able to pass that down to your children, your children's children, and your children's children. And in order to do that, you first of all have to be willing. You have to have the first mindset to be able to do it. And what we want to do today is try to help you develop that mindset by giving you some information today about how to create generational wealth. Mm-hmm. So let's dive into it today, man. Talking about creating generational wealth. What's the foremost thing that you want to give to people today when it comes to creating generational wealth?
I think it's something that we all can do in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And how impactful the gift that we leave is will be determined by the planning that we do while we have an opportunity. Mm-hmm. I think we're all going to leave a legacy of some way, shape, form, or fashion. Yeah. How long that legacy is remembered will depend on what you do while you're here. So for me, I want to be remembered, forever and ever. I want to touch my kids. And I believe a righteous man leave the heritage to his children. So for me, that's what I live by. That's what I built my company on. Yeah. Unfortunately, generational wealth is a term and terminology I feel like it's kind of used all too often nowadays. Everybody's talking generational wealth or helping create generational wealth and not really understanding, things that go into, making sure that actual wealth that we create, whether it be through, stocks, bonds, real estate, cash, whatever it is that we have from an asset perspective, do we have a plan with how that asset is going to transfer to the next generation? And understanding how to properly put those things together to make sure that, my beneficiaries receive what I want them to have. I mean, all too often, I think we've all, heard those stories and had those horror stories in our families where, someone owned a house in the family and, someone passes away and, nobody can find the deed to the house, and nobody's been, we have no estate plan and there's no trust in place. So the house ended up going into probate and all of a sudden, this person contesting, that person contesting. Well, the taxes didn't get paid on the house. All of a sudden, somebody's came in a tax sale and bought the house from up under us, or we got to come up with the money for that, or just, no planning whatsoever. Now, yeah, family members fighting and bickering over, who's supposed to get the house. Mama said I was supposed to get it. Sister said she wanted me to have it. And now we have the infighting that does not lead to success and does not lead to, good family relations, allowing us to hopefully work together and how to continue to build and pass on to future generations. Is not setting a good example, for our kids and for our future. So, biggest thing is having a conversation like we always talked about. Big, topic of contention that we've had from the beginning has been planning. And unfortunately, we don't like to plan as a community. We fly by the seat of our plans way too much. When it's a hope that things are going to work out versus sitting down and making sure and putting things in writing so we can make sure we ensure the success and not just say, I hope to have success. Well, that's the things that we can do to ensure that, to guarantee that we have that success. But it all starts with, having the right conversations and and taking a step and doing the proper planning.
All right. So having that conversation and create generational wealth is first thing and foremost that you need to have. Because if you're not talking about it, then the likelihood of you actually doing it is less likely. So it all starts with your mindset, starts with the talk. So when somebody does have that mindset and wants to have that conversation, how does that conversation go when they come to see you?
Well, usually it's ironic. A lot of times people want to come in and they want to jump from, I'm investing some money and I want to leave a legacy. I want to set up my estate plan. I want to have a will, a trust. And I heard I need to have a trust, or somebody was telling me about it at work. And, I asked them, I said, well, have you got your retirement plan in place first? And they said, well, no, I got a pension on the job, or I got my 401k, and I just want to make sure I leave some money to my grandkids. And I'm like, okay, well, that's great. But if we haven't ensured that the retirement plan is set, there would be nothing to leave the kids and the grandkids when it comes down to doing the estate planning.
Okay.
Because if we haven't planned for the retirement aspect, if we don't make sure we got the right income planning, and all of a sudden you do get into retirement and all of a sudden you need some type of long-term care assistance, and you got to go into a nursing home, or you need to have home health care, and those costs of home health care easily are $40,000-$50,000 per year. Nursing homes are even more expensive than that if it's around the clock care and things of that nature. So if you think about how much you have in a 401k, and just say you had a $500,000 in a 401k,
Okay.
and all of a sudden you had to go into a nursing home facility, and that's, for 3 years, and that costs you $70,000 a year. Well, that's $70,000, that's after tax. But the money in your 401k is pre-tax. So by the time it's going to cost you $100,000 to get $70,000 net to pay for the nursing home. So that's $300,000 in 3 years that's disappeared just to cover nursing home costs. Now, hopefully we ain't got a mortgage. Hopefully we don't have other bills and other things we got to take care of, which I'm sure we will. So now all of a sudden that other $200,000 that we had left over had to be utilized as well for other expenses and maintenance, upkeep. So all of a sudden you thought you had $500,000 that you want to leave to the next generation, and now that's been diminishing. You may be leaving $100,000, and that $100,000 is still taxable. And so we always say, okay, well, let's make sure we have the retirement plan in place. Let's make sure that we have, your foundation set fundamentally. What kind of insurance do you have? We always talked about, a few weeks back, the right kind to have is just any kind when you die. But we talked about the difference in term and permanent, and term is temporary. Permanent, of course, lasts forever. We want to make sure that you do have some permanent coverage, because if you have that term and it's expired, and all of a sudden you're 75 and you want to leave a legacy, well, how are you able to leave that? So that planning that comes in the retirement phase of life, we can't ignore that, because that lays the foundation to have any kind of estate to pass on. Now, we're going to hopefully you have a home, that you'll be hopefully passing on. But if you don't own that home, is that home going to turn into an asset or a liability? If you're passing that on to the next generation and they don't have the cash, and they're not receiving the insurance benefit to pay the mortgage, to pay for the insurance, to pay for if you got HOA fees, to pay if you got, the power, the water, the gas, all the things that come along with having a home. So making sure that we've done some planning, from a retirement aspect, to make sure we're leaving something, because most people are hoping to have an estate to leave, but they haven't planned to make sure that what they have will actually be received by the beneficiaries. Because I tell people all the time, debt and taxes don't die when you die. They transfer. So taxes going to transfer and your debt going to transfer. Now, who is it going to transfer to? It's going to be dependent upon who's the executive of your estate, who are the beneficiaries in your situation, your spouse situation. So all those things are going to come into play, but we have to make sure that we don't put the cart before the horse. We have to do the necessary planning. So if you want to leave a legacy, the planning for leaving a legacy starts at the same time when you start doing retirement planning, and even before. So when people ask me, Mr. Hamilton, when should I get a financial advisor? The day you start working. Because if you want to have a retirement and you want to leave a legacy, there's no such thing as starting too soon.
Okay. So that conversation, that's the conversation that you're having, is that once somebody comes in to establish generational wealth and an estate planning, is having a conversation about what is it that you have, what is it that you desire to do.
Absolutely.
And having that conversation first and foremost with themselves, then praying to God, and then also coming and seeking out the right financial advisor. And that's why we are here on V94.9 and also on YouTube and your wherever you get your streaming, is to encourage you to seek out the right financial planner, prayerfully Mr. Wilbur Hamilton. And if not, that you find somebody that you can have that conversation with and get your planning correct. Because while we are promoting ourselves, we're also promoting the health and the wealth and the prosperity of our own community. We want to see everybody win. We want to see nobody lacking in our community. I think that that's part of the issue that happens when it comes to crime and various things that happen in our community is we fail to take the time and have the right conversations about what we have. We don't truly take a value in who we are and what we truly have. We feel that generational wealth, legacy planning is only left for the 1%, which is the people that are the richest of the rich, right? But what we're striving to encourage you today is that if you are a breathing, living being, you owe it to yourself to establish a plan for your life. You owe it to yourself and the generations to come to sit down and plan out how your wealth will be transferred. Because whatever it is that you own, that's your legacy. Absolutely. Right? It doesn't matter whether if you have a vehicle and that vehicle is only worth $100, guess what? That vehicle is worth something in this current world, in this current financial structure that we live in. Therefore, when you leave here, that vehicle is going to be passed down to somebody. Absolutely. Somebody's going to have to take ownership of it. If it sits up in a yard, most municipalities, they have rules and regulations where they will fine you for having vehicles just sitting in your yard, right? So that's part of the negative planning, negative legacy that we can leave is you leave something that does have value, but then you don't have a right plan for it. Then it ends up taking away from the generation that's to come. And now you begin to dig a hole for them instead of building a solid foundation for them as they move forward. So we want you to have the conversations with God, have the conversations with a financial advisor like Hamilton Wealth Advisors, so that you can establish your estate correctly. Right? No matter what it is that you have, it's yours. Place value on yourself. Place value on everything that you have. Don't look down on yourself and what you have and say what I don't have. Because I think, Mr. Hamilton, that's what hinders us many times is we are waiting until we amass a certain amount of things and then want to do something. But like you said, the time to start is time you start working. Time you start acquiring things is the time to start. Don't look at yourself and devalue yourself and talk about what you don't have. No, look at yourself and see, what is it that I have? Take inventory of everything that you own. And when it comes to doing a business plan, all right, that's what I've found out since I've over the last, I would say 6-7 years, I've really learned about true business plan, right? And understanding assets versus liability. Absolutely. Right. And doing those things and striving to get loans from a bank. And in doing that, it's really as in the church, I would say a come to Jesus moment, right? Because it really makes you look at yourself and you say, man, I really have to see what I really have and what am I really doing, honestly. And it gives you a true picture of yourself. And once you start doing that, it makes you think about things differently. It makes you move differently and do things differently. And so we want to encourage everybody to take the time and sit down and make some plans for yourself. So also in that, Mr. Hamilton, when we talk about what are some key components to successful estate planning?
Yeah, it's a few things that kind of go into it. I mean, of course, most commonly people, heard of having a will. And obviously there's a, trust involved in estate planning. There's things called healthcare directives, and power of attorneys. Okay. Those are just to kind of name a few of the kind of the core essential items Obviously, there are a lot more, can get a lot more detail. But for now, we just want to help the community have an understanding of what are the basics and some of the necessary items that you need to have inside of a successful estate plan. So after you've done the retirement plan and you got your house in order, you know the assets that are going to be left to the next generation. Having those other things are essential, because if you lose on any one of those, it can be detrimental to all of those. So I'm a firm believer in, I'm not really a big fan of wills. I'd rather have a trust.
Okay.
And a lot of times people don't, say, well, do I need a will? Do I need a trust? I'm like, well, if you have any assets that you want to make sure get to where you want them to go, it's better to have a trust than to have a will. A will just says who you want to inherit certain assets.
Okay.
But a will does not bypass probate. So you still have to go through the court system. So if you willed your home to your niece, your nephew, your son, your daughter, whoever it may be, they still have to go through the court system in order to make sure that that asset is transferred from one party to the next. Now, how you leaving that asset? Are you leaving that asset in good standing? Are you leaving some additional assets to go along with being able to maintain that asset? That always comes a part of the planning. Now, I'm a proponent of having a trust instead of a will, because whereas a will just says where you want your stuff to go,
Okay.
a trust says where, when, and how. So it not just says I want my son to inherit my home. It says I want them to inherit my home, and it says what they can do with my home and what they can't do with my home. It gives all of my wishes. It says I want them to be able to sell. I want them to not be able to sell. I want them to maintain this asset. Whatever I plan on doing, I can lay it out inside of a trust. And is what I like to say is being able to control your stuff from the grave. So you want to be able to make sure you can dictate, but one of the most important things that having a trust does is it bypasses the court system and bypasses probate altogether. So you eliminate the possibility of having a contestable situation.
Okay.
Well, we've all heard about those situations people had in their families where, mom died or sister died, and there's a few siblings or, a few kids, and all of a sudden they fighting over, mama said, I'm going to have the house, or, she said, I'm going to get it. And now all of a sudden you have infighting. Or you have siblings fighting over, the kids fighting against the aunties and uncles because they trying to decide who gonna have what.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, if you have a trust and have those things laid out, well, there is no conversation.
Okay.
It's put in black and white, and we can avoid that process altogether. Now there's nothing and no one to be mad at other than the person who's no longer here, who put their wishes in black and white and they're set in stone. So there is no contestability in that situation. So that is the biggest difference in why it's needed. Because we don't want to have the issue of when someone passes away, we're already dealing with enough just from a grief perspective.
Right.
We're dealing with having a lot of changeover, in our life emotionally with the loss of a loved one. So when you throw in an economic loss, when you throw in changes in situations that we've never dealt with in most occurrences where we're having to deal with the court system, now we have to find an attorney. We have to find someone to help us in this process. Who do we trust? And if we have no experience in this area, now all of a sudden we're a little bit weary in the person we're even talking to. Well, guess what? Do we have the money to hire an attorney to even go to court and contest? And this is where a lot of assets have been lost in our community because we didn't have the money to go and contest certain things. So now all of a sudden we're behind the 8 ball. We're trying to establish and maintain assets that should have stayed in our communities and been passed on from generation to generation without the interference of anyone else.
Wow. That's good. That's good. So that's the difference between a will and a trust. And you recommend having a trust tells everything where it's going to go and how it's going to go. But a will does lay out some things, but it can be contested and has to go before the probate court.
Correct.
So that's good. So we're going to go to commercial. And then once we come back, we're going to go back into some of those successful components for estate planning. See you back in a moment. Welcome back to Closing the Gap podcast, The Truth About Black Wealth. I am your co-host, Mr. Eddie Richardson, here with our host and owner of Hamilton Wealth Advisors, Mr. Wilbur Hamilton. And we've been talking about creating generational wealth, leaving a legacy and touching the lives of those that we will never meet, passing down from now until later and later and later and later. And so we closed out, before we went to the commercial, Mr. Hamilton, you were talking about the key components to successful estate planning. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the difference between a will and a trust. And you laid out a good example about wills. They are good. They have their value, but they can end up in probate court.
Absolutely.
Right. And so having a trust is something that is definitely worth looking at and making that investment in doing a trust, because a trust tells everything that you have and everybody that you're leaving into what they can and can't do with it. And that with a trust, how long is a trust in perpetuity when you lay that out? Or,
so I can't say it's in perpetuity. It varies from state to state, and then also based on the type of trust. But the average trust usually lasts about 200 years.
Okay.
So it lasts usually multiple lifetimes.
Mm-hmm.
And then usually, if a trust is built that way, there's other trusts that's going to spin off of that trust.
Okay.
We're going to be created, from that trust. So in theory, mm-hmm. it can last forever if the proper planning is done. Mm-hmm. And if the preparation and design of it is for it to be in perpetuity. So those are things that we have to think about, mm-hmm. and we want to plan for. And if that's our desire, we can definitely make that happen. But we have to definitely plan for that, because if you just say, you know what, I'm leaving my assets to my son or my daughter. Mm-hmm. Well, are you leaving them to them? Is the trust going to pay them out, mm-hmm. or is the trust going to pay to another trust? Mm-hmm. I would say you definitely want those assets paying to another trust, because that gives them a layer of protection that otherwise they wouldn't have had. Because any assets that are passed down, and as long as the assets stay inside of an irrevocable trust, then there's some protection that go along with that. And I'm putting the cart before the horse a little bit, but I'm gonna just kind of giving them a little free game, a little teaser. And as we jump into, before we jump into that, I'm gonna go back and I want to touch on two components of the successful estate plan.
Okay.
And
let's talk about that healthcare direction.
Yeah,
let's go there, and then we'll circle back to those things on that trust.
Yeah, and those are key, because we've seen an uptick. And, especially since COVID, mm-hmm. People going to the hospital. I had several clients that actually went into the hospital, were there for long periods of time, and, on, ventilators and things of that nature. And of course, a lot of people passed away. Mm-hmm. Well, when those type of events happen, and now being that I've been to the hospital before, mm-hmm. and I've been to the doctor and had preventative measures, they ask you when you go in before they do any kind of, operation or anything they're doing, they ask you, do you have any kind of trust or living will? Do you have a healthcare director? Mm-hmm. They ask you that when you go to the hospital now, mm-hmm. because that's what dictates and says, okay, well, some people have wishes that says, I don't want to be resuscitated. Mm-hmm. Will you accept blood? Now, I'll accept everything. Mm-hmm. And I use my healthcare director to paint it in perfect light that mm-hmm. my wife can't pull the plug on me. Mm-hmm. She has to let me fight mm-hmm. until the Lord says he don't want me to fight no more. I have that in writing, but then you can actually have that put in and says, you know what, if I'm, a vegetable, so to speak, for 6 months, 8 months, 3 months, whatever it may be. Right. And if I'm not responsive at this point in time, you can pull the plug. Mm-hmm. And the reason why having a healthcare directive is important is at a time when someone is probably going to be the most emotional, do you want them having to think about and make decisions under those situations, circumstances, under that type of duress? Mm-hmm. So for me, it's about doing a prior planning, because I don't want my wife, who's probably going to be emotional, I'm assuming, mm-hmm. if something were to happen to me and I'm in that kind of state in the hospital, I don't want her to have to worry about what I would want to happen. Mm-hmm. I've already put it in writing, mm-hmm. what I want to happen. Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to that, I actually have my brother along with her as decision makers in my healthcare directive. Mm-hmm. So I can make sure that there's someone else to co-sign mm-hmm. whatever decision is going to be made or not be made. So having a healthcare directive is essential, because those are things that I call them a living debt. Mm-hmm. You can be here mm-hmm. and not be passed away. So your family haven't received any insurance money from you passing, but there's still bills that are accumulating. So if there are things that still need to be handled, well, guess what? They need to have access to that. And that's where the power of attorney comes in. So that's why someone is deciding the fate of me from a health situation,
Right.
but also from a financial situation if I'm incapacitated, but I run a business. Well, bills still have to get paid for the business. The rent still has to be paid on office spaces. Employees still need to be compensated for the work they're doing, even if I'm not there. Right. So things still have to be able to run. Who is going to be the person that has that power and authority to take care of that? You know, what gives my wife access to my bank account? If she's not on that particular bank account, she would need a power of attorney to actually have access to those funds to utilize. So these are things that, you know, we don't think about because unfortunately, you know, we don't like to plan until things actually happen. Whereas I'm all about being proactive and not reactive. That's the best way to be. We don't want to wait for something to happen and then try to figure out why it went wrong. Well, we just have to do the best we can in that moment. And if I plan for it, I have things that are put in place to help my family and my loved ones cope and make the burden a little bit easier. I don't want my family scrambling, trying to figure out what to do in the event of something happening. I want to have already laid that out. So they know how they're going to pay the bills. We know who has access to those things. And you can have multiple people. And I'll tell you what I'm saying. It don't have to be the same person.
Okay.
You know, I have different people for different things. You know, I have my sisters actually in charge of my finances in certain situations. And I have my brother, the decision maker in other situations. Because from a health standpoint, I use my brother because I'm thinking he would be the least emotional and be able to hopefully make a better decision under those circumstances. Whereas financially, my sister makes good financial decisions and she's very, you know, she's very cost conscious when it comes to certain things. So her in helping my wife making those decisions. So that way we can ensure that things are still being handled the way I want them to be handled with a certain level of care and concern, but with my input and influence and my fingerprints all over everything that's going on way before something happens. Now, I hope to never have to use a healthcare director.
Right.
I hope to never have to need a power of attorney, but you know, we don't get to control what the Lord decides to do when he decides to do it. But it is my responsibility to be prepared for any situation that could come about when it comes to this thing called life.
Yeah, that's good. Because even 1 Corinthians 15 and 53 definitely says that this corruptible must put on incorruption and this mortal must put on immortality. So what that's saying is that death is going to come. We are going to be changed. Absolutely. And so we have to accept that reality and not be afraid to talk about the possibility of death. We are not saying that is our desire. We want to live, have a prosperous life. And that's why we're even here on the radio and doing this podcast, is to make the proper plans that we can live well, live healthy, live wealthy while we are here and be able to pass on that wealth, live good in that wealth for ourselves. Absolutely. But then also pass that on to generation after generation after generation. So we want all of our listeners to realize that, hey, you need to make the right plan, get a will, get a trust, get this healthcare directive, because we all have health challenges that come about. Some that are of our own fault based on the way that we eat and the lack of exercise thereof, or whatever the case may be. There are some things that are hereditary that we get just because of our lineage, our bloodline, and we have no control over those things. But we want you to take control of the things that you have the power to take control of. Absolutely. And so that's successful estate planning, is also taking care of your health, understanding what's going on with you, and planning properly in the midst of those things. So, Sam, we just, you talked about that power of attorney and healthcare directive. Let's circle back, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir.
And talk about that, who should be, I think you also touched about with your family, your brother, your wife, your sister, all in conjunction with each other.
Absolutely.
Being in charge of your estate plan, essentially, right? Because you want them to be able to balance things out. We know that our immediate family, wives, children, at whatever age they are, being that I'm father, you may be a little too emotional. You need some assistance. You want so we want the family to be there together. Yes. And be able to sit down and make certain plans. And that's the way that you've laid it out for you. And what we want to encourage our listeners is to think about that as well, right? Process that in your own mind about, okay, who in with around you can make those types of plans together? Who gets along the best, right? We all know the different contentions that we have in our family and the people that can do things the way that we like to do them, who thinks the way that we think, who has our best interests in mind when it comes to our health, has our best interests in mind when it comes to our finances, who has our best interests in mind when it comes to our kids, right?
Absolutely.
So just be honest with yourself when you're having a conversation with yourself about it in order to make the right plans for yourself and your life. And in saying that, is it possible that we could even lay out friends in that, like people that are not even blood kin to us?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm actually in several of my clients' trusts as a investment advisor, because they don't want their kids, which are their beneficiaries, when they inherit the assets, they don't want them running off making decisions on their own. They want to have me there as a liaison to basically help guide them along the way. So there's no restriction on who you can have. You can have your attorney. You can have, your cousin. You can have your best friend that you grew up with. You can have whoever you want to have. I've seen situations where, also one situation, the guy had his ex-wife still in the trust because he wanted to make sure that, he had been with her actually longer than his current wife. And he wanted to make sure that she still received certain assets. So he had a trust that she was on, and he had his wife still in that same trust, his current wife, and as a beneficiary. So there was no denying the situation. He said, look, I have nothing against either one of y'all. He said, baby, I'm married to you, but I do feel like I have a responsibility because I also have children with my first wife. So the responsible thing in his mind to do was to set up something to make sure that everybody was taken care of in some way, shape, form, or fashion. So there's no restriction into how you set up and structure your trust. That's the great thing about having a trust, is that you can create it and lay it out to meet your specific request. I've had situations, of course, where, you have, fathers who don't necessarily agree with their daughter's husbands. And they're saying, you know what? If I was to just leave my stuff to my daughter, well, she's married to this man, he's going to have equal rights to this stuff as well. But if I put my assets inside of a trust and I name solely my wife as beneficiary of my daughter as beneficiary of this trust, he does not automatically get ownership or control if something were to happen to me and pass away, because the trust is going to maintain ownership of this particular said asset at that particular point in time. So there's some things that we can do to help ourselves, help our kids, and foresee things that even our kids and grandkids won't be able to see that come along. So, there's definitely no limits to what you can do and how you can do it. It's just a matter of having a conversation with someone who can help design what it is you're trying to do. And this is why, we promote, being professionals and seeking out professional help, because we don't have enough African-American estate planning attorneys that we can turn to. We have far too many attorneys that practice the same type of law. We don't have enough attorneys that are practicing in this particular area, which is why we don't get a lot of information on doing the proper estate planning. We end up leaning into one area or the other because of that's where we feel like the need is, or we feel like that's where the money is in this particular area of law. Well, as we start to generate more wealth in our communities, there's going to be a greater need, and already is a greater need for this. If we just simply look at the real estate that could have been maintained in our communities that was lost, if those assets had been put inside a trust and passed down to the next generation, you think about the value of land and how it's gone up exponentially just right here in the Birmingham metro area. And with things that have gone up over time, that house that grandmama and granddaddy bought for $50,000, back in, 1965, and now it's valued at over probably $500,000. That was an asset that was lost because there was no planning that was done. It wasn't put inside of a trust. It wasn't maintained. It was lost through the probate courts. And we all have had those stories in our families where assets have been lost because, grandmama didn't know where granddaddy kept the deed. And we had no proof of what was what. And all of a sudden, we've seen records, in some kind of way, just imaginarily lost, not to be found in certain places. I've witnessed it in my own family. My mom from down in Wilcox County, and I always there's been a lot of records lost of land that was owned by people in our community. Well, if we'd have had some trust planning, if we'd have had some estate planning being done, if we'd have just had the conversation like we talked about, well, we knew what was going on in the house, and we weren't so secretive about things, because unfortunately we have that taboo in our community where we don't talk finances. We don't talk about what we own and what we have. When I understand you want to tell everybody your business, but there needs to be somebody to know, especially your spouse.
Yeah.
She needs to know where to go, what to do, when to do. She doesn't need to be in a situation. And I didn't want my wife to be in a situation where if something happened to me, she wouldn't know where to turn. I wanted to have it laid out and in black and white, so she knows exactly what to do, when to do, and how to do to make the transition as easy as possible. And I also have that in place because I hear a lot of men tell me, Mr. Hamilton, I ain't trying to leave no bunch of money for my wife to take care of some other man. And I said, well, guess what? If you leave her enough money, she ain't got to bring another man into the house.
Yeah.
75% of women have remarried because of financial obligations they couldn't meet alone. So if you want to make sure you keep the wrong type of man out of your house, and make sure your wife doesn't have to settle for any kind of man because she needs help in paying the bills, well, make sure you do some estate planning, because you leave off enough, she can be comfortable and she can marry out of love, not out of necessity.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good. So in doing that, what I also thought about with that, about building that trust out too, is as I think about, Abraham, and I think about the 12 tribes of Israel, that covenant God made with Abraham. And then you come down to, the 12 tribes of Israel, the sons of Jacob, and each one had a responsibility. That was, somewhat of a trust, I would say, how God trusted them, and then he laid a plan and entrusted them to do certain things. So with the trust, and I say that to say that with the trust, thinking about the tribe of Levi, they were always the priests, right? And whoever was in that generation after generation after generation of Levi, that's where you get a Levitical priesthood. And it didn't matter what you might have wanted to do. What you had to do was be a priest in the temple. So when you're dealing with a trust and dealing with education for the next generation, can we also lay out in that trust and dictate to the same way we dictate what can be done with the money, with the property? Can we also in there dictate and say, hey, I need such and such amount of children to go and major in XYZ type of degree?
Yeah, so you can put in stipulations that says basically, in order for this child to receive funding, I am willing to pay for the education under these circumstances. And if they are to go to this particular school, if they were to major in this particular area of study, I'm willing to give them this. If they don't meet these qualifications, don't do this, then they don't get that. So I even have it even after. So I have a firm believer, if you don't work, you don't eat. So you can have it to where, you can say, I don't want my kids just living off me, just living off my money. Well, you can have it set to where they get a percentage bonus based on their own income. Where they get a 10% bonus every year based on the work that they're doing. So if they make $50,000, they get $5,000. If they make $100,000, they get $10,000. If they make zero, they get zero. So I'm a firm believer in nothing from nothing leaves nothing.
Yeah.
So if you don't do nothing, you don't get nothing. See you back in a minute.
All right. Welcome back to Closing the Gap podcast, Truth About Black Wealth. I'm your co-host, Mr. Eddie Richardson, here with our host and the owner of Hamilton Wealth Advisors, Mr. Wilbur Hamilton. And we're just talking about the fact that in a trust, you can dictate to whoever you have in that trust what they can and can't do. So with that, let's talk about the difference between this revocable and an irrevocable trust, because I think that's kind of where we were going in that is what somebody can and can't do. So please explain to us, Mr. Hamilton, those things.
Basically, what you want to look at is there's two fundamentally, types of trust. There's a revocable trust, which basically, both of them say where your assets are supposed to go and when they're supposed to go and how they're supposed to go. The biggest difference is with a revocable trust is that you don't get into what's called asset protection around that. So your assets will go where you want it to go. But if you were to be sued or you have some type of lawsuit or there's some type of debt or creditor after you, you don't have any protection against for those assets. Those assets are up for grabs, so to speak, when it comes to from a contestability standpoint, from an asset protection standpoint. With the irrevocable trust, with that trust, basically, it does provide asset protection. So not only does it tell you where your assets can go, when they can go, and how they're going to go, it also protects anyone from outside of that trust from getting access to it. So if you're in some type of lawsuit, you have some type of credit, debt obligation, you have some things going on where someone trying to contest it, because of the asset protection that goes on with that particular type of trust, they are safeguarded. And there are some guardrails up where no one has access into it. So there's a lot more protection around it. So you want to look at based on the type of assets you have and maybe the type of business that you operate within. Most business owners need to have some type of trust, because if your business, makes a mistake and does something wrong and someone comes after you to sue your business, well, if your personal assets are not inside of a trust where they're protected, well, what's the first thing that the person's going to sue? They're going to sue you and your business. They're not going to just stop with the company. They're going to come after you personally. So we hear about it all the time with, people getting into car accidents. And if your son or daughter gets in the car accident, they're not going to just stop at going after the son or daughter, the insurance company. They're going to come after mom and dad too. So whatever assets that you have that are not in a actual irrevocable trust can be up for grabs. That's why you hear people talk about having umbrella policies and things of that nature from the insurance protector to protect themselves in the event of something happening. This is just another layer of protection. There's a lot of different uses, for having irrevocable trusts. It's ways of protecting yourself, making sure assets go and are passed down to the right generation the way you want them to be, without interference from outside individuals. It's a way of making sure that if you have an irrevocable trust, so to speak, and you have, I have sons, God forbid my sons have, just say, go through divorces or have kids, outside a relationship or whatever it may be. And all of a sudden that young lady's trying to come after them for child support, or they say, well, we think your dad had a little bit of money. We want to come and try to take all those things that your father left for you. Well, if I put those assets inside an irrevocable trust and he just the beneficiary of some of those assets on an occasional basis, well, she would not be able to come after him and get into those assets. I've now protected him from having certain liability in future situations. So that's a way of being able to protect not just myself, but also my kids and future kids. So as long as those assets are maintained inside of the trust, it provides protection. So having the right type of trust for your situation is key and imperative. Is why we always preach, and you always hear when talking about seeking out professional help, seeking out experienced individuals that can help you put together your plan to make sure you can be executed. Because at some particular point in time, the plan that you put in play is going to need to be executed. That's the thing. We don't know when. But at some point in time, it's going to need to be executed. And you want to make sure that plan has been put together by someone who's done it before, who's experienced in doing it, who's knowledgeable in doing it, and has an expertise in operating in that area. So, which is why we need more people in our community helping with the estate planning. Because if we start to assimilate this wealth, and now we're still having to turn to people outside of our community to build the estate plan, well, what do you think is going to happen with some of those estates? You think it's going to be airtight? What are the likelihood you think it's going to be 100% foolproof if someone outside of your community, not saying that that's going to happen all the time, but we have to just ask ourselves these logical questions. Communities are going to take care of their communities first. We have been the wealth drivers and generators for this country and for this economy since before this country and economy existed. And we have continued to be that. All of the land and the resources that we've had that's been, misappropriated, to say the least. This is why we need to have that, and which is why we need to be able to turn to our own people that look like us, who have been through what we've been through, that can share our concern, but not are experienced and have the expertise to make sure that these things that have happened to us in the past don't happen to us again.
No, that's good. So knowing with your trust, you got to have somebody that you can trust to establish that trust.
Absolutely.
So in doing that, having that. How does this trust and this estate planning really help us close the wealth gap?
So, and we talked about from the beginning. People always ask me, Mr. Hamilton, what's the greatest driver? What is the biggest thing we need in our community to close the wealth gap? You heard me always say trust, and it serves multiple purposes. Not only trust from man to man, but trust when it comes to our assets, because we can have it all, and it can disappear overnight if proper planning is not done. Because there's this thing called estate taxes that we're not as familiar with in our community. And that's where they tax. So right now, I want to say the state tax limit is about $11.5 million. So anything above that is going to be taxed. I believe it's a 40% rate on the dollar right now. So if I'm worth, just say $20 million hypothetically, and I have an exemption for $11.5 million, that means that's $8.5 million that's going to be taxed by the federal government.
Okay.
And let's just say at a 40% clip on $80 million, that means I'm going to owe almost about $3 million. Now, one thing that we know about most people and their assets, all of their assets are usually not in cash. It's in real estate. It's in business holdings. It may be in artwork. It may be in land. It may be in commodities. It may be some form of investment portfolio. Well, if I was at one point in time, I was worth 20, but now I got to come up with, $3 million in cash, and I don't have the $3 million in cash. Just say a majority of my portfolio, like we like to do, is all in real estate. Because we like to say, I'm going to leave my son and my daughter all my properties. And all these properties I've accumulated. I got these properties that's worth $15 million. But now I don't have but $1 million in cash, but I owe $3 million to the IRS. Well, now I got to come up with $2 million to pay to them. Where's that $2 million going to come from? So that means now those properties that I owned, I'm going to have to sell. Now, because in the time frame that the IRS says I have to pay this money after the death of that person, now I don't have time to wait to be patient and sell them on my time. Now it's a fire sale. Now I have to sell for whatever I can get for it and maybe not get full value. So automatically from one generation to the next, a $20 million estate has now been cut in half just due to improper planning, not having in the proper type of insurance, not having, that's where the difference between term and permanent. We always hear me say, term is temporary, death is permanent. You need to have some permanent insurance inside if you want to be doing proper estate planning, because that's the one question we don't know. People always say, I'm going to get a term policy to cover that. I said, well, you must know when you go die then. Because that term has an expiration date on it. At some point in time, it's not going to be here. So are you going to still be here when that term policy expires? Now, if we knew the answer to that question, then it's fine. But most of us don't know the answer to that question. God ain't revealed to us. And if he did, we probably wouldn't be focused on life the way we'd be focused on. We'd be doing some different things. But because we don't know, and because we have to do the proper planning, it gives us a chance, if we do things the right way, and I have the right insurance in place, and I know, okay, well, I have this liability because all of my assets are tied up in this. I have this insurance policy that can cover the estate taxes that are now used to be paid for if someone happens to me. So that's why people ask, okay, when you get a home, do you have mortgage protection insurance on it? Do you have those things? It's yes to cover that mortgage, but also it's down the road. So if from an estate planning standpoint, I need to make sure that these taxes that could come into play are not covered. Now, see, these are things that haven't been a concern in our community before because we haven't had a lot of wealthy individuals in our communities where that's been a point of contention. But with the sheer cost and value and of land and real estate going up, we're going to have a lot of people in the future that's going to fall into this category. And that limit, which is a lot higher now than it used to be, that limit at one point in time was just $2 million. So a person, if you're worth $10 million and there's a $2 million state tax limit, so that $8 million, well, now you owe $3.6 million back in taxes. Well, now you only have $1 million in cash. So now that $10 million estate is now been cut in half. So what you thought you were leaving, you're now not leaving any of it. And we've seen this happen in most areas. You can think about think about the Rockefellers, 'cause that's the biggest one who've done it successfully.
Yeah.
But you think about some of the other lineages that, what's the one, the Biltmores and some of the other, wealthy families that didn't do it the right way and whose legacies have been diminished overnight. I mean, I've seen what people thought were huge legacies, people that were 30, 40, $50 million pass away unexpectedly, have no estate plan. And all of a sudden, assets they thought they had have now been taken away and stripped because creditors have come in. And if you don't have a trust now, when you have debt obligations, on top of that, you now have creditors coming in. Well, you know what? They're getting this piece of real estate. We're getting access to that cash. We're getting this. I had a situation where literally a creditor came in. The gentleman passed away. He didn't have an estate plan in place. The company filed a lawsuit. They actually went in and pulled the assets directly from the bank account of that particular individual to pay off the debts of that particular. And this was a business. This was a guy that was worth $20, $30 million when he was alive. And all of a sudden, his family is left scrambling. And the cash they thought they had, a creditor's filed a lawsuit, and because he didn't have any irrevocable trust, his cash and assets were not protected and safeguarded. So these are things that have happened in our community, although not as frequently as in other communities because we haven't had that type of wealth. But it's going to become more prevalent because we are doing so much better financially. We do have more people in our community that have and own real estate because people understand the powerful tool that real estate is. We do have some business owners who are becoming successful, but if you don't lock up and secure that last piece of the puzzle, where if you've done a great job investing and growing your business or investing into stocks and bonds and real estate, if you've done the retirement plan and you've lived well, but if you don't finish it off and put together a successful trust plan, everything that you work for can disappear in the blinking of an eye if it's not properly protected. And that's why you hear me say, well, my passion is teaching my community how to create generational wealth, because when I look at an individual, I want to think about the end and the beginning. That's why I'm asking, what are we trying to accomplish and what are we trying to do? I need to make sure that I plan for the worst, then hope for the best. I need to take into account everything that may come along. As a financial advisor, my job is to see what my client does not see, not to see what they hope to see. And that's where far too often people make way too much mistakes because most people are going to be overly optimistic. We're only going to think about the good that can possibly happen by the things that we do. We don't think about what could not happen. We only think about what will happen. When people come to my office and want to talk about investment, we only talk about how much money they can make. Nobody want to talk about how much money they could possibly lose if the situation does not work out the way they want it to work out. That's my job. And as a professional, if you're meeting with someone and they're not talking to you about all of the different things that could happen, good and bad, there's not someone you need to work with, because there's no such thing as having a great day every day. We know that the rain is going to come. Now, we do know the sun is going to shine another day, but we got to be able to weather that storm. Or I guess it's going to feel like that sun ain't going to ever shine out again. So, we have to start doing that planning. We have to make sure that we make, preparation, for what we want to happen, and not just hope that, well, I've done enough. I'm going to leave that to them. I've heard that far too many occasions. People say, well, I've done all I'm going to do. Whatever they're going to do, they're going to do. I'm just going to leave them this. No. We have to be the change we want to see. On far too many occasions, we have people that have become satisfied with what they feel like they've done and not taking the extra step. Because when I look back at, what my parents went through and when my parents look at what their parents went through, everybody went through something. And it's everybody's job to put the next generation in a better position. So I have more knowledge and intellect and access to information. Why would I not put my kids in a better situation? Because guess what? When my grandparents was fighting them civil rights battles, my parents were the beneficiaries of that.
Correct.
And they put me in a position to have a better education and a better life, so-called, than what they had. It's my job to do the same for the next generation. So I should be able to educate my kids more, give them more access to information, but also should be able to set them up. So if my sons want to go into business, I need to have some seed money ready for them to go. I need to be able to provide some structure because I've learned that we need structure and planning. So if my sons are starting a business and they don't have any structure and any planning going along with it, is it their fault or is it my fault because I didn't prepare that?
That's good. So hence from what you're saying, that's what goes to the text that you like to quote in Proverbs 13:22 about a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of a sinner is laid up for the just. So if you are not focused on leaving something, if you are saying that I've done enough, you are not exemplifying what the scripture says being good.
Absolutely.
Being the good man, because the good one leaves that inheritance. The good one thinks about what's to come after now.
Absolutely.
Right? So when we're talking about good, scriptures is not talking about, hey, being a good as in just a good person living. But in that text of Proverbs chapter 13, good is synonymous with being righteous. And being righteous is being a person that follows the will of God. Absolutely. It's a person that seeks to please God. And so what has been laid out thus far today in talking about generational wealth, creating generational wealth, leaving a legacy, touching the lives of those that you'll never meet, is about being righteous before God. Absolutely. Having that righteous foundation, understanding that all that you have comes from God.
Absolutely.
Right? When God allowed the Israelites to be delivered from Pharaoh in Egypt, and he sent them into a land flowing with milk and honey and having the good of the land, he always wanted to remind them and told them to remember that it's the Lord your God that did it. Right? And by remembering that God did this for you, then you will, in hopes, remember the next generation. And then that generation will remember the next generation. So when we talk about train up a child in the way that they should go, and when they grow old, they will not depart from it. This, first of all, talks about having the foundation in God. But then, however you train your child, they're going to not grow old and depart from it. Absolutely. So if we train our children in this type of generational wealth building, then they are going to do the same thing. And that's what we want to impress upon the people today, is that we want you to build, but then also train the next generation how to build. And the best way to do it is by example.
Yes.
Because when you lay out a trust and you lay out a plan and you have those conversations with the kids are going to remember those conversations that you had with them. As I was watching the high school basketball championships this weekend, there were a lot of commercials. There was one commercial in particular that they had these kids they were juxtaposing the kids that had conversations with their parents versus those that didn't. And they were displaying and saying that, hey, the ones that were comfortable having conversations about life and things with their parents were the ones that were least likely to veer off and do drugs, do alcohol, and get lost. But they were willing to have those conversations. Those that knew that they could trust their parents and have those conversations would talk about things that they went through and that they were going through, and wouldn't seek out alcohol and things like that for what they're doing. And so I bring that up to say, have the conversations, like you said, with the next generation so that you can build that trust. And then you can pass down what you have to them and know that everything that you got, it comes from God. And God, in that text, we want to just remind them again, the text, your favorite quote, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So the question is, what are you going to leave to your children's children? We'll see you next time.